So it all started about 170 years ago with our friend Charles Darwin here, who wrote in his red notebook, very famously, "I think," and he drew what was the first evolutionary tree, if you like. So this is it on the left-hand side here, with one species changing into another. So this is the transmutation of species. And this was really wasn't the first time actually that people had come up with the idea of species changing. That was already an established idea. In fact, Darwin's own grandfather, who's Erasmus Darwin, wrote a book, Zoonomia, which he wrote, "Would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament?" And that was maybe sort of 70 years earlier or something like that. So that's already an established idea. But the idea of how this could change, how one species could actually change into another, now that was entirely Darwin's, and that was the theory of evolution by natural selection. And at the time of Darwin's death, about 50 years later, this is him being buried in Westminster, it was already an established idea amongst scientists within the UK. So it was already accepted. That's not to say it wasn't a controversial idea. And there was very famous debates that went on during Darwin's lifetime, particularly with Darwin's bulldog here, Thomas Henry Huxley, a famous debate in Oxford, which is depicted in Vanity Fair with Bishop Wilberforce, where the theory of evolution was defended. And that debate continues today. So the majority of people in the world still don't believe that humans are descended from the rest of the animal kingdom. So this is a book on intelligent design of pandas and people, which really encapsulates this. So every so often this tries to be put into the biological syllabus in the States, various different states, usually further south. This is really encapsulated, I think, a couple of years ago with this film Creation, where Paul Bettany very ably plays a young Charles Darwin. He's got the receding hairline really down to a T. This was actually banned from some of the states in America because it was deemed too controversial. So this is still a really hot topic. This is incredibly important. And to understand the theory of evolution is absolutely essential if you're to be a biologist. I think it's also essential just generally for everyone. Everyone should study evolution because it holds a mirror up to ourselves and places ourselves within the natural world, understanding how we've actually come to be. It's also completely crucial as far as understanding natural history is concerned. So Darwin very often puts this best when he says, "When we contemplate every complex structure and instinct as the summing up of many contrivances, each useful to its possessor, in the same way as any great mechanical invention is the summing up of the labour, the experience, the reason, and even the blunders of numerous workmen. When we thus view each organic being, how far more interesting, I speak from experience, does the study of natural history become?" And that's absolutely true. You really have to understand evolution if you have to understand any aspect of biology. That's essential. So what's the aim of evolutionary biology? Well, what we're trying to do in evolutionary biology is to understand the why rather than the how. So why have these individual animals, these plants, all the species on Earth come to look like they are? So this is a beautiful flower mantis. We might be asking the question, why has it got this incredible forelimb here, this kind of claw-like forelimb, raptorial forelimb it's called? We could talk about it in terms of the structure, but what we're thinking about is the why. Perhaps it's got this forelimb because it enables it to catch other animals, to feed on them, and therefore to be able to survive and reproduce. And that's the kind of crux of evolution by natural selection. We've got one here actually. If I've got some specimens at the front, so at the end you can kind of have a look at some of these things actually, sort of in the flesh, as it were. We can also think about this, another nice example here with the swallowtail larvae. And I think this is one of my favourites. This is a young instar swallowtail larvae, which looks almost exactly like a bird poo. And again, that's amazing, that's an incredible adaptation. And we can think about that perhaps in structural forms, i.e. it's got this complex cuticle which is capable of having different structures within it, capable of producing different colour patterns. It's also got behaviour, it sits there looking and behaving a bit like a bird poo. But that's not the crux of it. What the reason is that this provides an excellent camouflage for the animal, so it's less likely to be eaten. And that's evolutionary biology. It's understanding the whys behind these complex structures, behind the behaviour of animals. Now, Darwin first got this idea, I think, or developed this idea from the work of this guy, Thomas Malthus, who was an economist, really. And he wrote an essay on population. And the key idea was that that people basically were increasing in number disproportionately to the amount of resources that they could have. So there'll be a constant struggle for existence, and at some point the numbers would get too great for those resources, and that was the idea of Malthus. And Darwin realised that this could be applied to natural populations. And once it struck me that under these circumstances, favourable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavourable ones destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of a new species. So the idea is this can be very strong selective pressure, and any individuals carrying favourable traits would reproduce more and pass on those characteristics to the next generation. He thought about this in terms of what's going to be known as the elephant problem, where he worked out, he thought, well, elephants are pretty slow reproducing animals, perhaps the slowest reproducing animals we've got. So how quickly would their populations increase if there wasn't some sort of selection, some sort of top on the numbers of elephants there could be? So imagine there was an elephant and it started to reproduce. Well, two elephants, you need two elephants to reproduce, of course. And over a very short period of time, you'd start getting more and more elephants. And as there was more elephants, well, there'd be more elephants to breed with, so their numbers would increase exponentially. And soon, you'd find out that pretty much the whole world would be full of elephants. In fact, in 5 centuries, there'd be something like 15 million elephants just from a single pair. Now, that's obviously not the case. And so Darwin realised there's very strong selection, even on these slow reproducing animals, to reduce their numbers and ultimately to select for individuals which have more beneficial traits. And that's evolution by natural selection. So under Darwin's terms, we have to think about this in terms of 3 main characteristics. There's got to be heredity in the population, bless you, where one individual will basically look, well, when it reproduces, its offspring will look basically like it. So it's like begats like. There's got to be some degree of variation in the population, which there clearly is in most animals and plants. And there's got to be a fitness difference, so a sort of a relative fitness related to that particular characteristic, healthier and unhealthier individuals, survival of the fittest. So that was Darwin's idea. So under his terms, we could describe natural selection as the differential survival and reproduction of individuals carrying these favourable traits. Now, no development of a theory ever comes easily. Darwin himself was very worried about the religious connotations of his theory, so he actually spent about 20 years mulling over this idea after that original notebook entry and trying to gather evidence for his theory. And he described himself as like a spider sitting in the middle of his web. And his correspondence was absolutely vast. It's all online, actually. It's really, really incredible. Not only did he correspond with all the major scientists of the day, he also corresponded with plant breeders, with pigeon fanciers, with agronomists all over the world, basically pulling in all of this information and basically trying to work out whether his theory was tenable and to provide evidence for it. Some of his colleagues at the time said he should try and publish his ideas a little bit earlier. And in fact, this all came to a head in 1858 when he got a letter from another naturalist, a guy called Alfred Russel Wallace, who was working in Borneo at the time. This is Wallace here. And in that letter, Wallace stated the theory of natural selection almost word for word as Darwin had come up with it. So Darwin suddenly realised that he'd been pipped to the post at the last minute. The story is quite a complex one, but eventually the two of them, or Darwin was persuaded that they should co-publish this idea together, and they did that to the London Lion Society in 1858, and they came up with what was a really punchy title to try and drive home this idea. On the tendency of species to form varieties, and on the perpetuation of varieties and species by natural selection. It's a punchy title, and it more or less disappeared without a splash. So this is the President of the Lion Society in the same year, describing it, which has not indeed, as a year, been marked by any of those striking discoveries, which at once revolutionised the Department of Science on which they bear. How wrong he was. But all of this changed the year later when Darwin published his great work, The Origin of Species, or On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. It's not very good at titles, Darwin. But this changed the world. It changed the way we viewed ourselves in it. It provided for the first time an idea of how one species could change into another, and ultimately how people could have come about. Not different from the natural world, but part of it. Now, there was lots of problems with Darwin's theory at that time. One of the main ones was how exactly traits could be passed on from one generation to another. This was before the advent of genetics, remember. And there was various ideas as to how traits perhaps could be developed and passed on. A sort of not a popular one, but one that was around at the time was often attributed to Jean-Baptiste Lamarck here. It's Lamarckism. And the idea here is that traits that organisms develop during their own lifetime could somehow be passed on to their generation, their offspring. So if I work very hard outside and become very muscly, perhaps my children will be correspondingly muscly. If a giraffe stretches its neck particularly far to try and get hold of an apple at the top of a tree or an acacia leaf, then perhaps its offspring will have slightly longer necks. So obviously this is incorrect. But central problem with a lot of these ideas, or these ideas of how a trait could be passed on and developed from generation to generation, is that over time, those favourable traits would inevitably be lost because of blending. So if you imagine you've got an individual here which is particularly successful, over the course of its life it's somehow managed to become more green than the other representatives of its species, and perhaps that means that it can camouflage particularly well amongst leaves. So it does very well, it can breed, fantastic. And it breeds with another member of the population. Well, inevitably that other member is not going to be green, so its offspring are going to be a bit green, which isn't quite as good as the original green individual. So gradually over time, you can imagine all of these traits would be lost. And that was a real problem for Darwinian evolution. And it wasn't solved actually till quite a long time later, when the work of this guy, Gregor Mendel, who was an Augustan friar, was rediscovered. He was actually working at the same time as Darwin, doing work. He's looking very disparagingly here at what I think is a pea. And he did work, this is stuff of schools really, on wrinkly and smooth peas. And with careful breeding studies, he worked out that traits aren't lost as an individual breed, rather it's maintained and can be reformed. And this is the idea of particulate inheritance, which is modern genetics, if you like. So Mendelian inheritance is often called, where an individual might breed with another individual, produce some sort of hybrid, but because the material is separate from the individual, it's particulate, we'd call them now genes or alleles, different forms of those genes, you can reform favourable individuals which can then be selected. And that's the actual crucial idea. So the marrying of these two ideas is often called the modern synthesis. And that's really the state that genetics is in now. And that was carried out by various people, actually, some of them working in Cambridge as well. Ronald Fisher was a big one. He worked out how Mendelian inheritance and Darwinian evolution could be mashed together sort of mathematically. JBS Holden did a lot of work on the pepper moth, very famous work, seeing how this selection could actually happen mathematically over time. And Cyril Wright did a lot of work looking at how other changes could be important in the genetic structure of population, particularly random chance. And together they really produced what we'd now call the modern synthesis, the modern idea of how evolution actually works. I think this demonstrates kind of the importance of a variety of people working. It also demonstrates you don't have to be a great looker to be a great biologist, I think, quite convincingly. So under this modern synthesis idea, we can now redefine a little bit Darwinian evolution. We've still got hereditary, we've still got variation, we've still got fitness differences, but here we're talking at the level of the gene. We're talking different forms of the gene which have got a particular fitness difference, rather than the individuals themselves. So under those terms, we could say that natural selection is the differential survival of alternative alleles, or of individuals carrying those alternative alleles. And that's modern evolution, that's the crux of it. Remember nothing else, that's the most important bit of the talk, I think. And as Peter Akins puts it, once molecules in this way have learnt to compete and create other molecules in their own image, elephants and things resembling elephants will in due course be found roaming through the countryside. And there's loads of examples of evolution actually happening in the real world. I mean, there's tons, an absolutely bewildering number. In every case that this has been studied, evolution has been found to be correct. That's a key point. There's some nice work here. This is one of my favourite examples, I think, of evolution actually happening. This is with Darwin's ground finches from the Galapagos Islands, in fact. Now, Darwin himself actually didn't really realise the significance of the Galapagos finches at all. In fact, he thought that all the finches that he found on the Galapagos Islands were a variety of different birds, including sort of songbirds, grosbeaks, all kinds of things, even wrens, actually. It wasn't until much later he realised that actually these finches were perhaps an important example of evolution happening. So finches aren't mentioned once in the origin of species. It's an interesting fact, again, something else to remember. Future work looked at these finches in a lot of detail, and particularly work of Peter and Rosemary Grant, who very heroically lived on a very remote island in the Galapagos, Daphne Island, for about 30 years on and off, studying the populations of a particular type of finch, this medium ground finch, which is the individuals on the left-hand side here. And they're very variable in form. Sometimes you have individuals with rather small beaks, sometimes individuals with very large beaks. And they also looked at, they basically looked at how these beak sizes changed over time, as well as every other aspect of the population biology of these animals. And they looked at how they changed in relation to the size of the seeds that they fed on, in relation to the environmental factors, and they also looked at how they changed in response to this. This is the kind of the baddie of the piece, the large-billed groundfinch. Is a potential kind of competitor with the medium-billed groundfinch. So these are the same species. This is a different species. They're rather similar. And what they found was a really beautiful study over 30 years. Incredibly important to have these long-term studies to actually understand how evolution can work. And what we've got here is an index, if you like, of beak size. Higher up here is a larger beak, lower down here is a smaller beak. And the beak size fluctuates over time, over those 30 years in which they're studying the population. And what they found, and this is natural selection. This is the selection for a particular trait which is changing as a result of the changing genetic structure. So amazing in its own right. They also found that it changed very, very markedly in response to different environmental factors. So red arrow here represents very severe drought that happened in the mid-1970s. And what this meant was that the number of seeds and the size of seeds tended to increase. The number of seeds decreased, the size of seeds increased. And what they saw was a very dramatic increase in the beak size of this population of finches on Daphne Island. Only the large-beaked ground finches were able to survive, and therefore their offspring had larger beaks, and the population beak size increased as a result. Another interesting thing was that the baddie of the piece, as I say, the large-billed groundfinch, turned up, and the population started to increase quite a long way through their study. And what then happened was another period of drought. And interestingly, this time, rather than the beak size increasing, actually decreased in the population. And the reason was there was very strong selective pressure for the large-billed finches to eat all of the large seeds that were left. So the only seeds now left to these poor medium-billed ground finches was the small seeds. And so actually the small-beaked individuals were then the ones to survive. The biggest selective pressure. And this is a huge change in the morphology of the species. So selection actually in action in the real world. So that's a kind of a bit of an overview of evolution, or natural selection generally. So what I'm going to try and do now is pull apart some of the ideas of why people still find maybe evolution difficult to understand, or sometimes difficult to accept. And a lot of this comes down to this, again, we're back to the swallowtail larvae. The idea that a complex structure can suddenly evolve in a species is sometimes difficult to understand. As Stephen Jay Gould put it, where's the edge in looking 5% like a turd? And this is a very important point. So how can a complex structure like this possibly be evolved in individual steps, generation by generation? And that's what must happen for evolution to occur, as Darwin had described it. A lot of the arguments are focused around the formation of the vertebrate eye. This is an incredibly complex structure. And again, what's the use of half an eye? How can this possibly have evolved? And Darwin himself was worried about this. And he said, to suppose that the eye, with all of its inimitable contrivances, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. But actually, it turns out the formation of eye and complex structures really isn't a challenge to evolution at all. In fact, there are examples of all of the different stages for potential invertebrate eye in the real world. All of these steps are advantageous because they're all moving towards a better vision in some kind of way. There's another, I guess, a modern advance which has been very useful to evolution, has been the advent of modern computers, mathematical techniques. This is, again, now it's a classic study from the mid-90s, where people actually set up evolution on a computer. They set up a program which would allow evolution of the eye in 1% stages, where each individual stage would have to be beneficial, and the idea would be moving from a single layer of photosynthetic, photoactive cells all the way down to a complex lens eye. And in those 1% stages, they found that the vertebrate eye could evolve in something like 400,000 generations, about 350,000 years. So not only is it possible for the eye, a complex structure, to develop, it's easy, it's quick. In evolutionary terms, it's a blink of an eye. Simple as that. So there's no challenge, I think, to Darwinian evolution through the development of complex structures. Another big change has been we've developed our understanding of the fossil record hugely. And there's examples now of this eye actually being developed through the fossil record in exactly the same way as Darwin actually predicted. This is quite a rare fossil. It's a pachyderm fish, about 400 million years old. Nice thing about it is it's got a sort of a sclerotic ring, it's called, a kind of a bony plate that covers its eye. So usually it's very difficult to see or to visualize how eyes could have evolved because they're soft structures and so they're difficult to preserve. But in this case, they are preserved. And it shows intermediate characteristics that we predict. It's a really remarkable fossil. These things were huge as well, meters long. Incredible. This is a bit of an aside, but just on the subject of this greater understanding of the fossil record, I think this is just a fantastic fossil. This is Mei Long, which apparently means sleeping dragon. But it's a fossil from the early birds, I suppose. And it's one of these amazing ones which is completely three-dimensional. It's all kind of possible to articulate it. And one of the things which it demonstrates is the supposed sleeping posture of this early bird. So this is a reconstruction as to how it might have slept. It's amazingly similar to the way that modern birds sleep. I think that's a remarkable thing. So we can get really surprising and unusual ideas of not just how structures can have evolved over time, but also how behaviour has evolved. It's wonderful. There are lots of other problems as well, potential problems with Darwin's theory, which were originally cited. And one of the main ones is these. Very, very often, between the sexes and species, you see big differences. Often the males are very showy and very gaudy, brightly coloured, large horns, whereas the females aren't. And the problem with this is that sometimes these differences between the sexes can actually be incredibly costly. To be a brightly coloured male often isn't a good thing at all. It can lead to increased predation and all kinds of other costly problems in actually producing these colours. There's a nice study looking at these collared lizards where they actually, this is a male, brightly coloured male here, sort of rock-coloured female on the bottom. And what they did in this study was to actually make model male lizards and varied their colour. They made them out of plasticine, actually, and put them all over the desert. And what they found was that brightly coloured males had far more bite marks from predators than less brightly coloured males. So there's a real cost here into being brightly coloured. So how can this possibly have evolved? If natural selection is differential survival of individuals carrying traits which increase their survival, how then in natural selection have we got individuals which have obviously got traits which are reducing their survival? What's going on here? Darwin himself was worried about this. Again, always good quotes from Darwin. I remember the time when the thought of the eye made me cold all over. But I've got over this stage of the complaint, and now trifling particulars of structure often make me feel very uncomfortable. The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick. So he's a sensitive chap, Darwin. But you needn't to worry. Actually, this fits in very well with the idea of evolution by natural selection. Evolution is the differential survival, yes, but it's also the reproduction. To survive is nothing, to reproduce is everything. And that's where this really comes down. It sort of comes down to the difference between men and women, in fact. So if we were to ask what the difference between men and women are, maybe I should do this, actually. But there's underlying biological differences, and I think the main one is the difference in potential reproductive rates between men and women. Men can reproduce an awful lot. They can leave an enormous number of offspring. Females rather less. We can see this throughout the animal kingdom, and you tend to see the larger the difference between the sexes in that potential reproduction, the larger the difference in the body form very often. So things like elephant seals, the males are enormous. The females are really quite small by comparison. There's a huge difference. Males can leave up to 100 offspring, females only 8. Similar situation with red deer. And the amazing thing with the humans, I think, is there's Sultan Mully Ismail, who's recorded the record for number of offspring, which is 867 offspring, which I think is pretty impressive. But actually, I think it pales into insignificance since the female record, which is 69. And amazing. It's a Russian peasant from the 1800s, and she did have lots of triplets and quadruplets, but even so, I think your heart goes out to them, really. And essentially, it's this difference which is important. So because of this, males will compete maximally for females. Females will tend to choose better males to reproduce with. So you have ardent males and choosy females. And that's the essential the difference you see. So it's all to do with the ways of maximising your number of offspring, passing on the genes that you're carrying into the next generation. And Darwin was aware of this in some of the structures. So he had his law of battle, where males would have these big, complex horns, big structures, be more muscly, be more heavily toothed. And that's fine. That's good and Victorian and sort of males competing for females. That's fine. And there's advances on that as well now. We now realise that this kind of competition doesn't actually stop with mating. You also get things like mate guarding very often. It's a beautiful example here with damselflies, where these are the males here guarding the females while they're laying eggs. So not mating anymore. What they're doing is they're stopping other males mating, in fact. So there's all kinds of competition further down the line. But what is more difficult to explain is the development of these structures, these kind of bright tail feathers and things which you see in these great birds of paradise, beautiful things. This is a plate from Wallace's book, actually, in the Malay Archipelago, where then males aren't actually directly competing for females. It seems rather that females are choosing males. And this, it seems, is exactly what's happening. Females are choosing males on the basis of these characteristics. Sometimes this characteristic can be very easy to understand. Essentially, a male comes with a gift. Male comes bearing a gift, and then the female will allow the male to mate. Which makes a lot of sense. So this is a non-genetic benefit. And this is a good example from the nursery web spider, when essentially the male nursery web spider will go out and catch a delicious and tasty-looking fly, wrap it lovingly in silk, and then bring it to the female as a nuptial gift. Other species do this. Some species of spiders do this to actually stop the females eating them, in fact. So if they provide a gift, the female's too busy eating the gift that then the males will actually survive the mating. If the gift isn't big enough, well... So there's this kind of direct benefit, that's fine. But there's sometimes examples where there is no gift. It's just simply on the basis of the characteristic of the male. I think this is one of the best studies. This is a manipulative study, slightly unfair, of this long-tailed widow bird, which is a thing about the size of a sparrow. This is a male in his full glory here, and he kind of sort of leaps up out of the vegetation with a very long tail, an enormously long tail, many times the length of the actual bird, and makes a kind of a pleasing noise. And that the females find absolutely irresistible, as you can imagine. And what these researchers did was they wanted to find out if this long tail was in fact being chosen by the females. And what they did very unfairly, they cut the tails off some of the males and glued the ends on to other males. So they produced sort of super attractive males and really rubbish males. And what they found was that, in fact, the attractiveness is exactly correlated with the length of the tail. Longer tailed males are, in fact, more attractive for these female widow birds. So it's a good example. So why are females choosing these traits? This really does produce a fitness difference. Males with long tails really are less likely to survive. So why on earth choose them? And there's various different ideas, and it all comes down to the underlying genetic structure of these males. So you can think about it a little bit in terms of a handicap. This male has got a long tail. He's going to be much easier to catch, and yet he's still alive. So therefore, he must have a very good underlying genetic structure. The rest of his genome must be good. Not just that, if you mate with a male with a long tail, your sons will also have that beneficial trait, and that will be passed on. So this is the idea. So it's an underlying indicator mechanism of overall health. And there's good examples of this actually being tested. So this is a nice example from the grey tree frog, where males basically call for females, and that calling, in the same way as a trait, is actually very costly. Bats can come up and pick up the males and eat them. So longer call males were allowed to mate, longer or shorter call males were allowed to mate with females, and then the offspring were taken away and raised elsewhere. And what they found was that the offspring of longer call males grew faster, they were healthier, better offspring. So that's a genetic benefit, very nicely tested here, because there's no actual direct feeding by the males or anything like that. So that's all fine. We can understand these very bright and varied structures in different organisms, but occasionally there's surprises. So a nice example is a lot of these songbirds. This is a fairy wren, in fact, from Australia. So it's a superb fairy wren. It really is superb. It's very, very bright-coloured male, very drab female. But these have nests where the males and females work together to raise their offspring. So the reproductive rate of these birds is exactly the same for the males and females. And yet, we see a brightly coloured male and a very drab female. So this is in reverse. Why on earth have we got these characteristics when there isn't a difference between the sexes? And this was a bit of a mystery until fairly recently. And I guess this marks the kind of advent of genetic techniques, where what researchers did here was they actually looked at the paternity, so who fathered all of the offspring in different nests. And they found out that far from it being two individuals raising their own offspring, in fact, most of the offspring in a nest of a male's often didn't belong to him at all. So there was all sorts of things going on behind the scenes. This was it was a case of suburbia, I think, where what would happen is, and this is the reason the researchers didn't know this until they actually used genetic techniques, the females very often, if they're with a male which they deem to have not be very good quality, what they'll do is they'll still stay with the male because it's useful having this male to help them raise the offspring. What they'll do is they'll get up early in the morning, amazingly before it's light, and they'll go off and they'll find a male which has got a much brighter blue colouring on him, and mate with him instead. And in these populations, amazingly, something like 80% of the offspring in any nest is actually not fathered by the male that's actually looking after them. Isn't that amazing? So these examples fit in very well with the overall theory. It's kind of cryptic. It's difficult to tell. And they say the genetic techniques, this development of these things called microsatellites and abilities, it's fingerprinting essentially, has enabled us to actually visualize that, when in fact it was very hard just from observing it. It all happened under the cover of darkness. Perhaps a more difficult example to marry with general evolutionary theory is examples of altruism in the animal world. And this is basically where individuals will help other individuals breed at a cost to themselves. So helping other individuals without actually getting any reproductive or survival benefits, it seems. So this is quite a confusing thing. A nice example of this actually happening with the social insects, perhaps the best ones. So you've got this example of this enormous termite nest here. In Africa, you've got people here in the foreground for size. These enormous structures are put together by, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of individuals, but most of those individuals in the nest won't breed at all themselves. They're just workers. So you'll just have, this is a nest that's being cut open here. This is the enormous queen here. She's quite big, like that. And then her king, so these in termites rather than ants, you actually do have a queen and a king. And these are the only reproductives in that whole nest, usually, apart from later the other ones were produced. Most of the individuals, the vast majority of individuals, are workers and guards who don't actually have any reproductive potential at all. They just help their parents to reproduce. So what on earth's going on here? This surely, you've got individuals which are now not breeding at all. How can this possibly fit in with evolution by natural selection? And they do all kinds of strange things together. So the ants are maybe the major example. It would be very costly to go out foraging and bring back all this prey, a large beetle here, which they're bringing back to the nest, all for no reproductive benefit. I think this is my favourite example. This is a satiates. This is a kind of a caste of ants which you find in sort of some desert regions, where these ants actually act as living larders for the rest of the nest. And what basically happens is they hang up upside down in underground chambers, and other individuals in the nest will come and actually regurgitate food into these individuals, who then swell up like a pot really. So they're often called honeypot ants. And then they'll act as a living store, if you like, for the rest of the nest. Remarkable thing, and obviously they're totally incapable of breeding themselves. So how can this possibly happen? And they're quite tasty as well. This is a member of our group here, just about to enjoy a honeypot ant. And we've actually got examples of these social animals, these truly eusocial species, even in the mammals as well. And there's a very beautiful example of a mammalian eusocial animal. This is a gorgeous, lovely thing. Here it is. It's the beautiful naked mole rat, where again you've got a very similar social structure to the ants and the termites, where you have a queen naked mole rat in the nest doing all the reproduction, and then lots of other individuals, like this worker, who then actually go out and do the foraging. They've got big teeth, they actually use them to dig through the soil. Again, they're from desert regions. So what's going on? I think a major step forward, which really stemmed from the sort of 1960s, was the development of this idea of kin selection. So the idea here is that to pass on your genes to the next generation, you don't actually have to reproduce yourself. You can just help closely related individuals to reproduce. And this comes down to a matter of costs, benefits, and ultimately to relatedness. So perhaps it's very common in the insects, because to actually go out and found your own nest or to start breeding yourself is a very risky business. Insects' lives tend to be rather short. There's lots of things which are trying to feed on them. So the chance of you actually reproducing yourself is very, very slight. But if you stay and help your parents, well then you've got quite a good chance of helping them to some extent and increasing your own reproductive rate as a result. So you can put this in context. If you're sort of the same sort of genetic structure as ourselves, as humans, you're about equal related to your offspring as you are to your full siblings. So in genetics terms, it makes no difference as to whether you help your parents reproduce or you reproduce yourself. And this is really the idea of kin selection. It was come up with a guy called W.D. Hamilton. And it tends to be that you're more likely to help individuals in this kind of way if you're more closely related to them. So it's a matter of cost, the relative chance, loss of reproduction as a result of helping, benefits in terms of the increased reproduction as a result of you helping, and relatedness in terms of how closely related you are to an individual that you help. That's kin selection. And the nice thing about this so-called Hamilton's rule is that you can define it very rigorously mathematically, and it can be tested, as it has been across the animal kingdom. It's a really nice example of evolution actually being adapted and changed. This is still totally consistent with Darwinian evolution. It's just that the inheritance pattern is slightly different. It's a clever example of it. Yeah, this is put very nicely, where it was suggested that by JBS Holden, when he was asked, would you lay down your life for a friend? He said, no, I wouldn't lay down my life for friends, but I would lay down my life for 2 brothers or for 8 cousins, related to the relatedness. Half related to your brothers, about 12.5% related to your cousins. So hopefully, what I've tried to do over the last sort of 40 minutes or so is give you a bit of an example of how natural selection has actually changed, how the theory was first developed, and how this theory of evolution has basically developed over time. Now, all I've done is really scratch the surface. There's advances happening in every direction. It's always an interesting time to be working in evolution. I just wanted to just give you a bit of a taster, some of the other big advances that have occurred. I think one of the main ones was just the rediscovery, I suppose, this century of the Burgess shale. So this is an incredible example very early on in the development of multi-celled animals, where a whole range of different life forms were discovered with very complex structures, often very different from the animals that we see around today. So these kind of discoveries in terms of the fossils are really producing very remarkable changes in the way that we think about the speed of evolution and how these things can actually happen. There's also been big advances in the underlying understanding of the genetic structure, so the sequencing of entire genomes, and also the differentiation of relatedness patterns between major groups of animals. So this is the insect family tree, which always traditionally used to be thought that insects were very closely related to centipedes and to millipedes. It now turns out from the genetic structure, actually they're very closely related to crustaceans. So there's a huge difference actually in the way that we view how different animals are actually related to each other. It's very remarkable. There's also been big advances in understanding the relatedness patterns right down at the bottom, the base of the tree of life. So how multi-celled animals are related to other major groups, so your bacteria and your so-called archaeobacteria. And I think one of the big step forwards has been the understanding, again, with this is all from genetic work, that multi-celled animals seem to be something like a hybrid between regular bacteria and archaeobacteria. So these 2 other major lineages. And the suggestion now is that eubacteria were actually the result of a symbiosis event where little archaeobacteria engulfed a eubacteria, and the result was a complex cell, if you like, which then developed and evolved into these multi-celled life forms. So this is really sort of focusing right down at the base of the tree of evolution and understanding how we're related to everything. An essential problem of this is actually understanding what this last universal common ancestor would actually have looked like. There's probably been multiple mass extinction events through time. Whole suites of organisms have been swept away and replaced. And so trying to understand what the first life form could have possibly been it's a very difficult thing. And again, I think this has also had big leaps forwards. So although now we'll reproduce, our genetic structure is DNA-based, it's thought that probably this wasn't the original reproductive structure. Perhaps something like RNA, single-stranded molecule, was the original reproductive structure, although that's now being challenged as well. And there's really amazing work being done, laboratory work, looking at whether single molecules are actually capable of catalyzing their own reproduction in the labs. This is recreating, perhaps, the first early life forms. Really amazing. So really pushing back the boundaries in a whole range of different directions, I think. So what's the future? Well, evolution is developing in every direction, isn't it? And research into it is as well. For me, and my own research, I'm really interested in understanding how understanding evolution is important for conservation. We've got perhaps more species alive on the planet today than there ever has been in the evolutionary past. A really remarkable number. So probably in terms of number of species now, we're somewhere, we don't really know actually, but maybe somewhere around the region of 8 million species alive. So understanding how those species have actually evolved and how those species are maintained globally is incredibly important. And one of the key reasons it's important is that we're perhaps facing another mass extinction event, this time caused by just one species, by us, by the amount of change that's being wreaked on the natural world. This is the example. There's actually very, very little data looking at number of species actually going extinct because the majority of species are insects. But this is from British butterflies. And essentially what you've got here is a whole range of the British species compared between the 1980s and now. And if they're to the left of the line, their populations have declined. If they're to the right, they've increased. And what you can see at a glance is about 3/4 of the species are declining. And I think understanding evolution is as important for conservation as it is for any other branch of biology, because you have to actually understand the relationships of these organisms with the environment and the relationships with other animals in that environment to actually be able to conserve them. And a bit of an upsetting, a kind of poignant example is of this butterfly, which is the large blue butterfly, which was a British subspecies, which very sadly went extinct in the 1960s. So this is now gone from the world. This is an example of a specimen from the collections here in Cambridge, actually. Now, this butterfly had an incredibly complex life history, which unfortunately was only determined in the last few years before it went extinct, so a little bit too late for it. But again, it just gives us an example of why we have to understand evolutionary biology, I think. And what happens with this butterfly is it's a chalk grassland specialist, and its larvae, when the eggs are first laid, feed on thyme, herbivorous in the way you'd expect caterpillars to be. But after a couple of sheds of their skin, they start behaving in a very strange and unusual way. They jump off the thyme, and they fall to the ground, and they swell themselves up, and they start making a strange squeaking noise. Amazing. And what they're actually doing is they're calling to ants. It's a particular type of ant. This is a type of meadow ant. It's a red ant, actually. It's a myrmica species. And what they're doing is actually they're mimicking the sounds of baby ants in the nest. So these ants turn up, and they start sort of touching these larvae and thinking, well, so they look a bit like ant larvae, and they sound like ant larvae. They don't really smell like ant larvae. And what the juvenile butterfly is actually doing is they're taking on the smell of the ant larvae as well. So gradually over time, these ants become absolutely convinced that somehow their younger siblings have made it up out of the nest and onto the surface. So they then take them back down into the ant's nest and put them in the brood chamber. And there the butterfly larvae start feeding on the ant's own sisters and eventually pupate underground and then emerge the next spring to start the whole thing over again. So that's an incredible bit of natural sort of evolution there, of this co-evolution between these different species. There's all kinds of defence the ants have, but at the moment the butterflies are winning. Now the unfortunate thing with this very close pattern of evolution was that the ants need very short grass to survive. They need to have very short grass, they've got high temperatures to their nest. And unfortunately what had happened on these chalk grasslands was that grazing had become non-economical and rabbit numbers had dropped because of mixed mitosis. And so although the butterflies appeared to be okay, their food plants were there, the ants weren't. And quite tragically, actually, the last few places they were found, there was still rabbit grazing, and conservation biologists thought that was probably a problem for the butterflies left. So they actually sealed off the areas to stop the rabbits getting in, and actually that ultimately drove the species to extinction. So understanding evolutionary biology is absolutely crucial. And hopefully what I've tried to do is, it's an exciting subject, it's an important subject, and it changes the way that we view natural history, the way we view ourselves in the world. I think this is absolutely crucial, it's really, really important. And understanding evolutionary biology in the light of conservation, I think is also an important topic. This is Alfred Russel Wallace again, the co-discoverer of natural selection. And he, back in the 1800s, was already worried about declines in species numbers and changes in habitat. So he wrote, "The kind of knowledge of world flora and fauna is of very slow growth. It is still very imperfect, and in many cases it will never now be obtained owing to the reckless destruction of forests, and with them the countless species of plants and animals that they contain." So already this is a problem. It's becoming more so now. We're losing this information before we've even had a chance to study it. We started with the Darwin Crate. Let's finish with the Darwin Crate. I think understanding this is important for understanding how we actually view our place. So Darwin writes, the last chapter of the last bit of the Origin of Species, "There is a grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst the planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and our being evolved.